The federal prosecutor leaned across the scarred metal table, his voice dripping with a faux sympathy that was far more terrifying than his anger. He looked at my gray hair, my trembling hands, and the handcuffs biting into my wrists, and he told me that 66-year-old widows don't survive federal prison. They die there, forgotten and alone. He was trying to terrify me into a confession, trying to crack the facade of the sweet old lady he thought sat before him. But as I sat there in that airless interrogation room with my wrists cuffed to the cold steel chair, I realized he didn't understand who he was dealing with. I wasn't trembling because I was afraid of prison. I was trembling because I had already survived something far worse than incarceration. I had survived the discovery that mercy is a business, that hope is a commodity sold to the desperate, and I was the only one willing to burn the whole corrupt marketplace to the ground to make it stop. 3 months earlier, I hadn't known any of this. 3 months earlier, I was just Margaret Thorne, a retired social worker, trying to navigate the suffocating silence of a house that had been too quiet since Edward died, looking for a way to fill the empty hours that stretched between breakfast and bedtime. 3 months earlier, I made the mistake that would destroy my life and save my soul. I walked into Grace Haven Women's Shelter. It was a Tuesday in November, the kind of gray, heavy afternoon that defines late autumn in Newton, Massachusetts, where the sky feels like a low ceiling pressing down on you, and the wind off the Charles River cuts through your coat like a serrated knife. I pulled my battered station wagon into the lot, parking next to a vehicle that seemed to mock everything the shelter supposedly stood for, a black Mercedes S-Class, gleaming and spotless, sporting Florida plates that looked obscenely bright against the bleak New England backdrop. I stood there for a moment, clutching a donation box filled with Edward's old blankets, and I felt that familiar, sickening twist in my gut. The instinct that had kept me alive through 40 years of social work, whispering that something here was fundamentally and dangerously wrong. In Newton, money usually insulated people from the kind of bleakness that hangs over shelters. This was one of the wealthiest zip codes in the state, a place where charity was often just another social event for the Back Bay elite. But standing in that parking lot, watching the dead leaves skitter across the asphalt, the cold felt personal, predatory, and inescapable. The woman who opened the door didn't look like a shelter director. She looked like she had just stepped out of a boardroom on Beacon Hill. She was dressed in a sharp designer suit that cost more than my car, with manicured nails that had clearly never scrubbed a floor or held the hand of a dying woman. And as she extended one hand to introduce herself as Amelia Kellerman, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty entryway. Her handshake was firm, the kind of calculated grip salespeople rehearse in mirrors to establish dominance while feigning connection. And her smile was a masterclass in professional warmth that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to Grace Haven," she said, her voice smooth as expensive whiskey. "We're so grateful for community volunteers." She led me past a resident mopping the hallway, a young woman, maybe 25, who kept her eyes strictly on the linoleum when Amelia passed, her shoulders tensing with a reaction that wasn't respect, but pure, unadulterated fear. Amelia didn't even acknowledge her presence, didn't offer a nod or a word of thanks. She simply walked past the woman as if she were a piece of furniture, a prop in the grand stage play of Amelia's benevolence. I should have left then. I should have turned around, marched back to my car, and driven home to my quiet and safe life. But I didn't. The tour took 15 minutes, but I was counting the whole time, my old social worker brain clicking into gear despite my best efforts to just be a nice volunteer. Amelia explained that they had 30 beds across 3 dormitories, currently housing 12 women. But as we walked through the facility, the math simply didn't add up. I counted 8 empty beds in the first room, 6 in the second, and when she opened the door to the third dormitory, I was hit with the stale, heavy air of a room that hadn't been used in months. It was completely vacant. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light filtering through the blinds, settling on 12 pristine, unmade mattresses that looked like they were waiting for ghosts. "We have to be selective," Amelia explained smoothly when she saw me lingering in the doorway. "Not every applicant is appropriate for our program. We have strict safety protocols and background requirements. We owe it to our donors to maintain a certain standard." Her voice was warm honey, but I watched her eyes track the resident mopping the floor, assessing, calculating, measuring the woman's worth in a way that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the look of a caretaker. It was the look of a landlord inspecting a tenant. We continued to the intake office, where a younger woman sat surrounded by mountains of paperwork. Her name tag read, Ray Morrison, Intake Coordinator, but she looked less like a coordinator and more like a woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Ray offered a brittle smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, looking exhausted and perhaps even terrified, as if she were constantly waiting for a blow that could come from any direction. When Amelia's phone suddenly buzzed against the desk, Ray's whole body tensed as though a gun had gone off in the room. I asked how many applications they received weekly, trying to sound casual, just a curious volunteer making conversation. Ray's eyes darted nervously toward Amelia before she murmured that they received 20 to 30 requests a week. "And how many do you accept?" I asked. Ray opened her mouth, but her voice went flat and scripted as she recited a vague line about availability and appropriateness, sounding less like a coordinator and more like a hostage reading a ransom note. "It depends heavily on our current capacity and the specific needs of the client," she said, the words sounding metallic and rehearsed. While Amelia explained the volunteer schedule, mornings mostly, helping with laundry and meal prep, the phone on Ray's desk rang. It was sharp, insistent, and cutting through the tension in the room. Ray's hand moved instinctively toward it, her fingers hovering over the receiver, but then she froze. Her eyes flicked to Amelia, who hadn't said a word but was watching her with a look of icy warning. The phone kept ringing. Ring after ring after ring. Nobody moved. I realized I was holding my breath, watching Ray's fingers curl into a fist on the desk, and watching her swallow whatever words she had been about to say. Finally, Amelia broke the silence, her voice smooth and dismissive, claiming that they screened calls during tours and that Ray would handle it later. She mentioned they had strict protocols I would learn in time, but the sharp look she shot, Ray suggested those protocols were less about efficiency and more about silence. She led me to a conference room to sign the paperwork, the volunteer agreement, confidentiality forms, and the code of conduct, standard bureaucratic hurdles until I reached page 7. There, buried in a dense paragraph of legalese, was a clause that made me pause. Volunteers must not discuss financial matters with clients or staff. Volunteers must not question intake decisions or operational procedures. All concerns must be reported directly to the director and no other entity. I mentioned that it was unusual language for a nonprofit, noting that most organizations I'd worked with encouraged transparency. Amelia's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of cool appraisal. She said they protected their clients' privacy and their donors' confidentiality, and that it was non-negotiable. I signed anyway, because I'd already decided to volunteer. Because Kara would be disappointed if I quit before I even started. Because I needed something to fill the hours since Edward died. But mostly I signed because I didn't know yet what I was signing away. As she walked me back to the entrance, Amelia's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, and for the first time, her face lit up with genuine emotion. Not warmth, but greed, though it wasn't clear to me at the time. She excused herself to take the call, stepping a few feet away, her voice dropping to an intimate murmur. I caught fragments of the conversation, words that didn't belong in a women's shelter, deposit clearing, beach house on the Cape, and transferring the rest by Friday. Ray appeared beside me, startling me. She whispered that I looked surprised. By what? I asked. She gestured vaguely at the building, at Amelia, and at the whole polished facade. All of it, she said quietly. Most people are. At first. When I asked what she meant, her eyes flicked toward where Amelia stood laughing into her phone, then back to me. She told me to forget she'd said anything, but her face screamed something else. Her hands twisted together, and her voice had an edge of desperation, like she was begging me to understand something she couldn't say out loud. The reception desk phone rang again. Since Amelia was distracted, Ray moved to answer it. I followed, standing just close enough to hear the tinny voice on the other end of the line. It was loud, pleading, a woman's voice thick with tears. I heard fragments. 3 children. Nowhere else to go. Sleeping in the car for 2 nights. Son has asthma, needs his medication. Ray's face crumpled as she listened. She looked at the 18 empty beds on her occupancy chart. I could see them from where I stood, and then she closed her eyes. I'm so sorry, she whispered into the receiver. We don't have space right now. We're at capacity. But we weren't. I had just seen the empty room. Ray covered the receiver and whispered fiercely to herself, or maybe to me, I don't make the decisions. Her eyes darted toward Amelia, who was still chatting about beach houses. We both knew who made the decisions. She went back to the call, took the woman's information, and promised to call if space opened up, a lie that tasted like ash just hearing it. She hung up, and I asked how long the woman had been calling. Ray looked at me, really looked at me, like she was weighing whether I was safe. 3 weeks, she said. She calls every day, every single day. Amelia keeps telling me to say we're full. Why? I asked, my voice rising. Ray shook her head. I don't know. I just follow orders. I have a daughter in college. I need this job. I can't afford to ask questions. Amelia's heels clicked on the floor, signaling her return. Ray's face went blank, the mask of the obedient employee slamming back into place. The moment was over. Amelia handed me a schedule. I'd start Monday, 3 days a week, morning shift, helping with meals, laundry, and basic client support. Nothing complex, just follow the guidelines. I took the schedule, thanked her, and walked to my car with that donation box still in my arms. Nobody had even looked at the blankets. In my rearview mirror, I watched Amelia walk to that Mercedes. I watched her slide into leather seats that cost more than a year's rent for most of her clients, and watched her check her makeup in the visor mirror before driving away. Here was a shelter director sliding into a $100,000 car. You turning away desperate women with children because they weren't appropriate, all while taking hushed calls about Cape Cod beach houses as families begged for basic shelter. I sat in that parking lot for 10 minutes, the engine idling, telling myself I was overthinking it, that there were reasonable explanations, that nonprofit directors deserved nice things too, that I was suspicious because grief made people paranoid. But then I saw the woman from the hallway standing outside near the dumpster, smoking a cigarette. She was staring at nothing with ancient eyes and shivering in a thin cardigan. I pulled over and rolled down my window. Are you okay? I asked. She looked at me, a 20-something body carrying the weight of a 50-year-old soul. She asked if I was the new volunteer. I said yes. My name was Maggie. She said hers was Carmen. I asked how long she'd been at the shelter. 4 months, she said, blowing smoke into the cold wind. I asked if it was helping, if they helped her. Carmen let out a laugh that sounded bitter and entirely broken, telling me that the staff didn't help the residents. They helped themselves, and the women just happened to live there. You'll figure it out, she said, dropping the cigarette and grinding it out with her heel. Everyone does eventually, if they stay long enough. She walked back inside without another word, and I drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel, the heater blasting but unable to touch the cold that had settled in my bones. I unpacked my donation box in my silent living room, putting the blankets in my own closet because Grace Haven hadn't wanted them. I sat at my kitchen table with Edward's photo and the silence of the house pressing in on me. I told him about my day, about the Mercedes, the empty beds, and the woman on the phone begging for space that apparently didn't exist. I asked him what he thought, if I was being paranoid. The photo didn't answer, but I knew what Edward would say. He'd say, trust your gut. He'd say when something looks wrong, it usually is. He'd say, don't look away just because it's uncomfortable. So I didn't. I opened my laptop and searched for Grace Haven Women's Shelter. I found their website immediately, which was plastered with glossy stock photos of smiling women and children, alongside glowing testimonials about lives saved and futures rebuilt, an agonizing contrast to the hollow eyes I had just seen in the hallway. I clicked on their financial reports, public information for nonprofits in Massachusetts. The most recent 990 form showed total revenue of $1.2 million last year. I grabbed a notepad and did the math. 12 women currently housed, capacity for 30. If they served an average of 20 women at any given time and each stayed an average of 3 months, that meant about 80 women served annually. 1.2 million divided by 80 women equaled $15,000 per woman. For what? Beds? Meals? Counseling that didn't seem to exist? I looked at the executive compensation section. Amelia Kellerman, executive director, annual salary $85,000, not enough to afford a Mercedes S-Class and a Cape Cod beach house. Not unless there was income. The form didn't show. My phone rang. It was Kara asking how the orientation went. I told her it was fine, that I'd start Monday, that the facility seemed nice. All lies, because I didn't want to worry her, because she'd tell me to quit if I explained my suspicions, because she still treated me like I needed protecting. But I didn't need protecting. I needed the truth, and I was going to find it even if it meant discovering something I couldn't unsee. Even if it meant learning that the place I'd come to help was actually a place that needed help itself. Monday morning couldn't come fast enough. I arrived at 7. The parking lot was empty, except for Ray's battered Honda. The Mercedes was nowhere in sight. I used the volunteer key Amelia had given me, and the building was quiet. Too quiet. A shelter with 12 women should have sounds, voices, movement, life. Instead, there was a silence that felt like held breath. I went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, trying to shake the feeling of unease. Simple enough. Start the coffee, scramble the eggs. That's when I heard voices from the front entrance. Rising, desperate. The sound of someone begging. I moved to the hallway, staying out of sight, and watched. A woman stood at the intake desk, her face a map of fresh violence with one eye swollen shut, while 2 terrified children clung to her legs in silence. The boy, maybe 8, was wheezing, his chest heaving with the effort to breathe, while the younger girl buried her face in her mother's coat. The woman was begging Ray for help. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking. My husband found us at my sister's. We can't go back there. We just need somewhere safe for a few days. Just until the hearing. Ray's hands were shaking as she apologized. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice trembling. We don't have availability right now. Your website says 30 beds, the woman cried. I checked. It says you take families. It's not about beds, Ray stammered, reciting the script Amelia must have drilled into her. It's about appropriate fit. The children. We aren't equipped for families right now. My son has asthma, the woman pleaded. He needs his medication. I can't leave them in the car to go to the pharmacy because he might find us. Please, just let us stay. The little girl started crying. Quiet, broken, the kind of crying that's given up on being heard. I stepped into the hallway before I could stop myself. We have 18 empty beds, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. I cleaned 3 empty rooms yesterday. Why can't they stay? Both women turned. Ray's face went white. Maggie, she whispered, you aren't supposed to be in this area during intake. I was in the kitchen, I said, walking closer. I heard voices. Why are we turning them away? The front door opened, and Amelia walked in. She was wearing a new designer coat and carrying a Starbucks cup, looking like she had just come from a leisurely brunch. She took in the scene, the battered woman, the crying children, me standing there defying her, and her face hardened into a mask of cold fury. Go to the kitchen, she ordered me, her voice low. She needs help, I insisted, pointing at the woman. Her children need help. We have the space. Amelia stepped into my personal space, her expensive perfume cloying in the stale air, and hissed that I had been here for exactly 1 day and didn't understand the standards and criteria required to maintain their donor base. This is not your decision, she said. If you cannot follow protocol, you can leave, right now. The woman at the desk grabbed Ray's hand, leaving a crumpled $20 bill on the counter. Please, she begged. It's all I have. Just let us stay. Amelia looked at the money, then at the woman, with eyes devoid of empathy. We cannot accommodate you, she said flatly. Leave now, or I will call the Newton police for trespassing. The woman stared in disbelief, then grabbed her children and ran. Literally ran. Like staying 1 more second would break her completely. I watched through the window as she collapsed in the parking lot next to a rusted Civic, her son struggling to breathe, her daughter weeping. Amelia closed the door and locked it. What the hell is wrong with you? I asked, the words exploding out of me. Amelia turned slowly. Excuse me? She needed help, I said, my voice shaking. We had empty beds. We have standards, Amelia said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. This is my shelter. I make the decisions. You fold laundry and serve meals. That is it. If you cannot accept that, there is the door. I wanted to walk out. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call the police myself. But looking at Amelia's calm, arrogant face, I realized that leaving would solve nothing. Leaving meant she won. Leaving meant I would never know why she was doing this. So I went to the kitchen, made breakfast, and served it to 9 women who barely looked at me. But my hands were shaking the entire time. After breakfast, I went to the laundry room to wash sheets, my mind racing. The laundry room shared a wall with Amelia's office, and the walls in this old building were paper thin. I was loading the washer when I heard Amelia's voice. She was on the phone. The gala is set for the Fairmont, she was saying. 300 confirmed, should clear 400,000. There was a pause, and then her voice changed. It dropped lower, becoming intimate and conspiratorial. I noticed the office door was cracked open just an inch, and as I walked past with the laundry basket, I froze. I pressed myself into the alcove, heart hammering against my ribs, and listened. Don't worry about the beach house furniture, she laughed. We can write it off as program supplies. Nobody checks the receipts anyway. Another pause. Kellerman Consulting will invoice $45,000 this month, she murmured. For training services and program development. Richard approved it. He gets his cut. He stays quiet. The words hit me like a physical blow. Kellerman Consulting, her own company. Invoicing the shelter. The board chairman getting a cut. I stood there in the hallway, clutching the laundry basket, my breath trapped in my chest. This wasn't just mismanagement. This wasn't just being selective. I was listening to the architecture of a federal crime, and the architect was sitting 10 feet away, unaware that the quiet volunteer in the hallway was listening to every word. I had found the truth, and it was worse than I could have ever imagined. I finished the laundry on autopilot, my hands moving through the mechanical motions of folding sheets and stacking towels, but my mind was miles away, racing through the labyrinth of what I had just overheard. Kellerman Consulting, kickbacks, program supplies. The words bounced around my skull like shrapnel, tearing apart whatever naive faith I still had in the goodness of this place. I was holding a terrifying secret, a grenade with the pin pulled, and I was standing in the very center of the blast zone. At noon, I forced myself to go to the dining hall, trying to mask the tremors in my hands by gripping my tray until my knuckles turned white. The room smelled of overboiled vegetables and industrial disinfectant, a sensory reminder of the institutional poverty these women lived in, while Amelia planned renovations for her beach house. I scanned the room and saw Carmen sitting at a corner table, picking at a plate of pasta that looked dry and cold. I walked over and sat down, expecting her to ignore me or tell me to leave, but she just shifted slightly to make room, her eyes never leaving her plate. "The food is terrible today," I said, testing the waters, trying to sound like a normal volunteer making small talk and not a woman who had just uncovered a felony. Carmen let out a short, dry laugh. "It's terrible every day," she said, her voice low, "but it's expensive." I paused, my fork hovering halfway to my mouth. "What do you mean?" I asked. "This is a shelter. The food is free." Carmen finally looked at me, her expression a mix of pity and exhaustion. "Nothing here is free, Maggie," she said, using the name I'd introduced myself with. "They call it program fees or suggested contributions. But if you don't pay, things happen. Your paperwork gets lost. You get written up for behavioral issues, and eventually you get asked to leave." A woman sitting across from us, a younger resident named Tasha, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, leaned in, checking to make sure Ray wasn't within earshot. "I paid $1,500 my first month," she whispered, the confession rushing out like water from a broken dam. "Amelia told me it was for job placement services, resume workshops, interview coaching. She said if I invested in myself, I'd be out of here in 6 weeks with a career." "And?" I asked, though I already felt the answer settling like a stone in my stomach. "And I've been here 3 months, Tasha said, her voice trembling. "I haven't seen a job counselor once. Every time I ask, they say the position is in transition or the schedule is full. But if I miss a payment, Amelia calls me into her office and talks about how maybe I'm not committed enough to my recovery." "It's a trap," Carmen murmured, stabbing a piece of broccoli. "She bleeds you dry, and when you have nothing left, she replaces you with someone who has a fresh bank account or a family willing to write a check." I stared at them, the pieces of the puzzle locking together with a terrifying click. It wasn't just embezzlement from donors. It was extortion. Amelia wasn't just stealing from the rich. She was cannibalizing the poor and turning desperate women into revenue streams until they ran dry. That afternoon, the summons came. Ray appeared at the door of the laundry room, looking pale and refusing to meet my eyes. "Amelia wants to see you," she said, her voice flat. "In her office, now." I walked down the hallway, the sound of my sneakers squeaking on the linoleum sounding obscenely loud in the quiet building. I passed the spot where I had eavesdropped earlier, and my heart hammered against my ribs, wondering if she knew. Had she seen a shadow? Had she heard a floorboard creak? Was I walking into a confrontation about the fraud? Amelia was sitting behind her mahogany desk, bathed in the soft light of a designer lamp that probably cost more than Tasha's program fees. She didn't look up when I entered, letting me stand there for a full minute while she typed on her computer. A power move designed to make me feel small, insignificant, and disposable. Finally, she stopped typing and looked at me, her face composed into a mask of professional concern that was far more chilling than anger. "Margaret," she said softly, using my full name. "Please sit down." I sat. The chair was low, forcing me to look up at her. "We need to talk about this morning," she began, clasping her hands on the desk. "Your behavior in the hallway was disturbing." "I was trying to help," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. That woman had nowhere to go. Amelia sighed, a sound of long-suffering patience. I know you think you were helping, but what you were actually doing was creating a liability and undermining my authority in front of my staff. You questioned my judgment, you violated protocol, and you displayed a level of emotional volatility that we simply cannot have around vulnerable clients. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine. I've been looking at your file, Margaret. You lost your husband recently, didn't you? Edward? The mention of his name in her mouth felt like a violation. 3 months ago, I said tightly. And this is your first time volunteering since then? Yes. Amelia nodded slowly, as if she had solved a complex equation. I think, she said, her voice dropping to a sympathetic purr, that you are grieving. I think you came here looking for a way to fix something because you couldn't fix him. And when you saw that woman this morning, you didn't see a client. You saw your own helplessness. You projected your trauma onto her, and you lashed out at me because you're angry at the world. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. She was taking my genuine concern for a battered woman and twisting it into a symptom of my own mental instability. She was rewriting the narrative before I could even speak. This isn't about my husband, I said, my voice shaking with suppressed rage. This is about 18 empty beds. This is about a woman sleeping in her car. This is about you not being a good fit for Grace Haven, Amelia interrupted, her voice hardening instantly. I'm terminating your volunteer agreement, effective immediately. You're firing me? I'm releasing you, she corrected smoothly. For your own good. You need time to heal, Margaret. You're not ready for this work. You're erratic, you're emotional, and frankly, you're a risk. She stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Ray will escort you to your car. Please do not return to the property, or we will be forced to treat it as trespassing. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy and numb. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to tell her I knew about Kellerman Consulting. I wanted to tell her I knew about the kickbacks in the beach house. But I didn't. Because if I tipped my hand now, she would destroy the evidence. She would shred the invoices, wipe the hard drives, and bury the truth so deep no one would ever find it. So I swallowed the bile in my throat, looked her in the eye, and said, I hope you sleep well, Amelia. She smiled, cold and victorious. I always do. I drove home in a daze, the anger slowly hardening into a cold, dense resolve. Amelia thought she had solved the problem. She thought she had dismissed a grieving, unstable widow who would go home, cry into her tea, and fade away. She had no idea she had just ignited a war. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, the blue light of the screen illuminating the empty chair where Edward used to sit. I pulled up the website for the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office, Nonprofit Organizations, Public Charities Division. I started typing. I poured everything into that complaint form. I detailed the turned-away families, the empty beds, the coerced program fees that Tasha and Carmen had told me about. And then I typed out what I had heard in the hallway, the specific names, the numbers, and the Kellerman Consulting scheme. I knew it was hearsay. I knew I didn't have documents. But surely the specific details, the name of the shell company, the amount of the invoices, would be enough to trigger an audit. Surely the state would care that a director was pocketing $45,000 a month while turning away battered women. I hit submit at 3 a.m., and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. The system existed to stop people like Amelia. I had rung the bell. Now, I just had to wait for the cavalry. The cavalry called 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon. I answered the phone on the first ring, my heart leaping into my throat. Hello? Is this Margaret Thorne? A man's voice, professional and bureaucratic. Yes, this is she. Miss Thorne, this is Kevin Palmer with the State Charity Registration Division. I'm calling regarding the complaint you filed against Grace Haven Women's Shelter. Thank God, I breathed, sinking onto the sofa. When will you be sending investigators? Do you need me to come in and give a sworn statement? There was a pause on the line, a heavy, uncomfortable silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Well, Miss Thorne, Kevin said, his voice shifting from professional to patronizing, we've actually already looked into the matter. We take allegations of fraud very seriously, so I contacted Amelia Kellerman immediately to discuss your concerns. My stomach dropped through the floor. You called her? Of course, it's standard procedure to allow the accused party to respond to allegations. Did you tell her it was me? I asked, my voice rising. Did you use my name? The complaint is a matter of record, Miss Thorne. We value transparency. I closed my eyes, pressing the phone against my ear until it hurt. She fired me 3 days ago because I asked questions. By telling her, you just gave her a warning. She'll destroy the evidence. Actually, Kevin interrupted, and I could practically hear the smirk through the receiver. Miss Kellerman was extremely transparent about that entity. Kellerman Consulting is a fully disclosed strategic arm approved by the board chairman. There is nothing illegal about a director being compensated for specialized expertise, Ms. Thorne. In fact, in the nonprofit world, it's quite standard for high-level talent to have multiple revenue streams. It appears you've mistaken standard corporate structure for a conspiracy. Compensated $45,000 a month? I snapped, while turning away women with children? Miss Kellerman explained that as well, Kevin said, and now I could hear the disdain in his voice. She expressed deep concern for you, Miss Thorne. She told us about your recent loss, about your difficulty adjusting to the volunteer role. She mentioned you were reprimanded for harassing staff and residents, and that you seemed to be suffering from some paranoid fixations. She's lying, I whispered, but I knew it didn't matter. She had gotten to him first. She had charmed him, showed him clean paperwork, and painted me as the crazy widow. She even showed us a note you supposedly left, Kevin continued, rambling about conspiracies. It's very sad, Miss Thorne. Grief does terrible things to the mind. I never left a note, I said, my voice trembling. She forged it. Miss Thorne, Kevin said, and now his voice was stern, a warning. Filing false reports with a state agency is a serious matter. Given your situation, we aren't going to pursue action against you this time, but I strongly suggest you seek support for your grief and leave the legal matters to the professionals. The complaint is closed as unsubstantiated. The line went dead. I sat there, holding the phone and listening to the dial tone drone on like a flat line. The system hadn't failed. It had worked exactly as designed. It protected the person with the paperwork, the title, and the explanation. It protected the Mercedes S-Class, not the woman sleeping in the Honda Civic. Amelia had anticipated this and had built a fortress of paper, board approvals, audits, and disclosed conflicts of interest that made her theft look like business. 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. I stared at the screen. Unknown caller. I knew who it was. I shouldn't have answered, but I needed to hear it. Hello, Margaret. Amelia's voice was warm, almost friendly, like she was calling to check on an old friend. You called the state, she said. It wasn't a question. I reported a crime, I said, my voice steady. You reported a delusion, she corrected gently. And in doing so, you embarrassed yourself. Kevin, Mr. Palmer, was very understanding. We had a lovely chat, and he agrees that you need help. You're stealing from those women, I said. I heard you. I know about the beach house. I know about Richard Voss getting his cut. The warmth vanished from her voice instantly, replaced by a cold, jagged edge. You know nothing. You are a lonely, sad old woman who walked into my building for 3 days and decided she knew how to run $1 million organization. You are nobody, Margaret. You have no power, you have no proof, and now you have no credibility. I'm not going to stop, I said. Oh, I think you are, she replied, because if you contact the state again, or the police, or any of my donors, I will sue you for defamation. I will take your house, I will take your pension, I will leave you destitute. And Margaret? She paused, letting the silence stretch. I filed for a restraining order. It's being processed now. Harassment, stalking, and making threats against staff. I have affidavits from Ray and from Richard Voss, the chairman of the board. If you come within 500 feet of Grace Haven or my home or me, you will be arrested. Do we understand each other? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Good, she said. Go back to your knitting, Margaret, and stay out of the way of the professionals. She hung up. I walked to the bathroom and threw up in the sink. The restraining order arrived by certified mail the following Tuesday. It was a thick envelope, heavy with the weight of the law. I had to sign for it, my handwriting shaky and unrecognizable, and as I tore it open at the kitchen table, I realized Amelia hadn't been bluffing. She hadn't just filed a simple order. She had filed a petition for protection from abuse, painting a terrifying picture of me. In her sworn affidavit, she claimed I had become obsessed with her, that I had cornered her in the parking lot, that I had screamed at residents, and that I had threatened to burn the place down after being fired. It was all lies, every word. But attached to the affidavit were supporting statements. One from Richard Voss, the board chairman, confirming my erratic and threatening behavior, and one from Ray. I read Ray's statement with a sick feeling in my gut. Margaret Thorne made me feel unsafe. She asked aggressive questions about money and refused to leave the intake area. I was afraid she might become violent. Ray, the woman who looked like a hostage. Amelia had forced her to sign this. Or maybe Ray had signed it willingly to keep her job and to pay her daughter's tuition. It didn't matter. The result was the same. I had no witnesses. I had no evidence. I had nothing but my word against a director, a board chairman, and an intake coordinator. I hired a lawyer anyway, Linda Vasquez, a sharp-eyed woman with an office overlooking Boston Common who charged $400 an hour. I paid her retainer from the life insurance money Edward had left me, telling myself it was an investment in justice. I sat in her leather chair, clutching the restraining order petition, and told her everything. I told her about the empty beds, the turned-away families, the overheard phone call, and the kickbacks. I told her about Kevin Palmer and the state complaint. Linda listened in silence, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she put her pen down and looked at me with an expression that was kind but devastatingly final. Margaret, she said gently, I believe you. Then we can fight this, I said, leaning forward. We can subpoena the financial records. We can depose Ray. We can... No, Linda interrupted. We can't. She tapped the petition. This is a hearing for a restraining order, not a fraud trial. The only thing the judge cares about is whether Amelia Kellerman feels unsafe. And right now, she has 3 sworn affidavits saying you were aggressive, erratic, and threatening. You have a dismissed state complaint and no physical evidence. But she's lying. It doesn't matter, Linda said. In the eyes of the court, she is a respected nonprofit director protecting her facility, and you are a disgruntled former volunteer. If we fight this and lose, and we will lose, the judge could issue a permanent order. He could order you to pay her legal fees. He could even find you in contempt if he thinks you're using the court process to harass her further. I sat back, the air leaving my lungs. So she wins? She gets to keep stealing, and I get labeled a stalker? The law isn't always about justice, Margaret. It's about what you can prove. Right now, you can't prove fraud. You can't prove embezzlement. All you can prove is that you're angry. Linda leaned forward. My advice? Accept the order. Don't admit guilt, but agree to stay away. Let it expire in a year. Move on with your life. Find another place to volunteer. Don't destroy yourself trying to tear down a woman who holds all the cards. And the women? I asked. The ones sleeping in cars? The ones paying illegal fees? Linda sighed. Someone else will have to help them. You can't. Not legally. If you try to investigate her now, if you try to get evidence, talk to residents, or go near that building, you will be violating a court order. That's a criminal offense. You will go to jail. Do you understand? You cannot be the one to fix this. I left her office an hour later, stepping out into the cold Boston afternoon. The city moved around me. Students rushing to class, tourists taking photos of the swan boats, and businessmen talking on phones. But I felt completely detached from it all. I drove home in silence, walked into my house, which smelled of dust and old memories, and sat in the living room as the sun went down, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor. Linda was right. Legally, I was dead. Margaret Thorne had been neutralized. I was documented, flagged, and barred. If Margaret Thorne walked into Grace Haven, she would be arrested. If Margaret Thorne asked questions, she would be sued. If Margaret Thorne tried to save those women, she would be destroyed. I looked at Edward's photo on the mantle. He looked so kind and so rule-abiding. He would have listened to the lawyer, he would have let it go, and he would have said it wasn't our fight. But Edward was dead. And the women at Grace Haven were alive, trapped in a machine that was grinding them down for parts. I thought about the woman with the swollen eye and the wheezing son. I thought about Tasha paying $1,500 for help she never got. And I thought about Amelia laughing about her beach house furniture. And I realized that Linda was right about one thing. Margaret Thorne couldn't win this fight. Margaret Thorne had to follow the law, to respect court orders, and be a good grieving widow. So if I wanted to stop Amelia Kellerman, Margaret Thorne had to die. And someone else, someone who didn't exist on paper, someone who had nothing to lose, someone who could walk through the front door of Grace Haven without triggering a police response, had to take her place. I stood up and walked to the bathroom mirror. I looked at my face, the face Amelia Kellerman had memorized, the face she had banned. It was time to change it. It was time to become a criminal. The death of Margaret Thorne didn't happen quickly. It was a slow, painful dismantling that took 2 weeks of agonizing effort. It wasn't enough to simply put on a wig or wear different clothes. Amelia Kellerman was a predator, and predators have an instinct for spotting deception. If I wanted to walk past her, look her in the eye, and convince her to let me into her kingdom, I couldn't just look different. I had to be different. I had to erase 40 years of confidence, stability, and middle-class comfort, and replace them with fear, desperation, and the hollowed-out posture of a woman who has nowhere left to run. I started with my body. Grief had already stolen my appetite, but now I weaponized it, stopping eating almost entirely. I survived on black coffee and dry toast, watching in the mirror as the soft curves of my face sharpened into gaunt angles. I lost 12 pounds in 10 days, and my clothes, the sensible slacks and cardigans of a retired social worker, began to hang off me like hand-me-downs, lending me an air of shrinkage, as if the world was slowly eating me alive. Then came the hair. I stood over my bathroom sink at 2 a.m, the fluorescent light humming overhead, staring at my reflection. My hair was a dignified silver bob, a style I'd worn for a decade. It was the hair of a woman who played bridge and volunteered at the library. I took the kitchen scissors and began to cut. My hands shook as the silver strands fell into the porcelain sink, piling up like gray feathers. I hacked it short, jagged, uneven. I wanted it to look like it had been cut in a hurry, in a bathroom much dirtier than mine, by hands that didn't care about vanity. Then I opened the box of cheap drugstore dye, espresso brown, and slathered the chemical paste onto my scalp. The smell of ammonia filled the small room, stinging my eyes and burning my nose, a sharp chemical reminder that I was crossing a line. When I washed it out an hour later, Margaret Thorne was gone. In her place was a woman with muddy, dark hair that highlighted the circles under her eyes and the new hollows in her cheeks. She looked hard. She looked tired. She looked like Linda Wright. But the disguise needed a history, a physical manifestation of trauma that would explain why a 66-year-old woman was seeking shelter. I decided on a limp, an old injury, untreated and aggravated. I spent hours walking around my house with a stone in my left shoe, forcing my body to favor the right side until the uneven gait became muscle memory. By the end of the week, my left hip actually ached, a sharp, grinding pain that shot down my leg with every step. I didn't need to act the pain anymore. I had created it. The hardest part, however, wasn't the physical change. It was the legal one. I needed a name, a history, an ID. I couldn't walk into Grace Haven without identification. They required it for background checks and for safety. If I handed them Margaret Thorne's license, the game would be over before it began. I called my nephew, David. He wasn't a criminal. He worked in prop design for a local theater company in Cambridge, but I knew he had access to equipment, to laminators and high-quality printers used to make fake documents for plays. I met him at a diner in Somerville, far from Newton, wearing a hat pulled low over my newly darkened hair. When he saw me, his eyes widened in shock. "Aunt Maggie? My God, are you okay?" "I'm fine, David," I lied, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "But I need a favor, and I need you to promise you won't ask why." He opened the envelope. Inside was a passport photo I'd taken myself against a white wall, looking down and away from the camera, devoid of makeup, the dark hair framing a fearful expression. Next to it was a slip of paper with the name Linda Wright, DOB 3/12/1958. "I need a driver's license," I whispered. "It doesn't have to be perfect, just good enough to pass a visual check." David looked from the photo to me, his face paling. He pushed the envelope back. "Aunt Maggie, this is a felony, forgery, identity fraud. If you get caught with this..." "If I get caught, I'll say I found it," I said, my voice hard. "I'll say I made it myself. I will never mention your name. But David, I need this. I can't explain why, but lives depend on it." He stared at me for a long time, searching my face for the aunt who used to bake him cookies, but she wasn't there anymore. Finally, he sighed, a sound of terrified resignation. "I can't believe I'm doing this," he muttered, sliding the envelope back into his jacket. "Give me 2 days." 2 days later, the license was in my mailbox. It was terrifyingly good. It not only felt real, it looked real. And holding it in my hand, seeing Linda Wright printed next to my face, I felt the heavy and crushing weight of the law settling on my shoulders. I was no longer just a woman violating a restraining order. I was now a forger, a fraudster, a criminal, and I was ready. On a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after I'd been fired and 2 weeks after the restraining order, I drove to Newton. I didn't take my car. Amelia might recognize it. I rented a battered gray Ford Taurus from a shady lot in Revere that took cash, parking it 4 blocks away from Grace Haven on a side street lined with shedding oak trees. The wind was brutal that day, whipping off the bay and cutting through the layers of mismatched clothes I wore, a Goodwill coat that smelled of mothballs, and a scarf that was fraying at the edges. I wasn't pretending to be cold. I was freezing. My body, weakened by the weight loss and the stress, shook uncontrollably. I walked the 4 blocks to the shelter, leaning heavily on my left leg, the phantom limp now agonizingly real. Every step was a rehearsal. I am Linda Wright. My husband hits me. I have nowhere to go. I am afraid. I repeated the mantra until it rhythmically matched the pain in my hip. Linda Wright, Linda Wright, Linda Wright. The shelter loomed ahead, the brick facade looking more like a fortress than ever. The black Mercedes was there in the lot, gleaming like a sleek predator lying in wait. Amelia was in. I stopped at the edge of the property, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was it, the point of no return. If I walked through those doors and Amelia recognized me, even for a second, she would call the police, and I would be arrested for violating the restraining order, for trespassing, and for possession of a forged instrument. I would die in prison, and Amelia would keep stealing, keep exploiting, and keep winning. I closed my eyes, summoned the image of the woman with the swollen eye being turned away, and forced my feet to move. I opened the door. The warmth of the lobby hit me, carrying the familiar scent of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. I kept my head down, shoulders hunched, making myself small. Ray was at the intake desk. She looked even more exhausted than she had 3 weeks ago, dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes. She was typing furiously, her phone cradled between her ear and shoulder. She looked up as I entered. "Can I help you?" I didn't look at her directly. I looked at her hands. I need a place," I whispered, adding a slight tremor to my voice and slipping into the vague, hesitant cadence I'd practiced. "Please, I don't have anywhere else." Ray's face softened instantly. "Okay," she said gently, putting the phone down. "It's okay. You're safe here. What's your name?" "Linda," I said. "Linda Wright." I waited for the spark of recognition. I waited for her to squint, to tilt her head, to say, "Maggie?" But she didn't. She just pulled out a clipboard. "Okay, Linda, have you been here before?" "No," I said. "Never." "Do you have identification?" This was the precipice. My hand trembled violently as I reached into my battered purse, my fingers brushing against the cold plastic of the license David had forged. I pulled it out and handed it to her, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, terrified that the lamination would peel, or the font would look wrong, or that she would simply look up and see the deception written in sweat on my forehead. Ray took it. She glanced at the photo and she glanced at me. Then she looked at the computer screen and started typing. She accepted it. It worked. "Ideally, we need a referral," Ray said, her voice apologetic. "But tell me what happened, Linda." I launched into the story I had constructed, a patchwork of tragedies I'd heard from clients over 40 years. "My husband, he retired last year. The drinking got worse. He started pushing, then hitting. Yesterday, he threw me down the stairs." I pulled up the sleeve of my coat to reveal the bruise on my forearm, a masterpiece of purple and yellow stage makeup I'd applied an hour ago. I waited until he passed out, took the car keys, and I drove. I just drove. Ray looked at the bruise, and I saw genuine pain in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Linda," she whispered. "You did the right thing." She started filling out the intake form. "We usually have a wait list," she said, lowering her voice. "But let me check with the director. We might be able to make an exception." She stood up. "Wait here?" She walked toward the office, Amelia's office. Panic flared in my chest, hot and bright. I hadn't expected to see Amelia this soon. I thought I'd be processed by Ray first. If Amelia saw me, she was sharper than Ray. She was paranoid. She knew my face. Minutes ticked by. I could hear the murmur of voices from the office. Ray's pleading tone, Amelia's sharp, questioning one. Then, footsteps. I hunched lower in the chair, staring at my scuffed boots and breathing through my mouth to keep from hyperventilating. "Linda?" The voice was unmistakable, smooth, authoritative, cold. I looked up slowly, shielding my eyes with a sweep of my dark, jagged bangs. Amelia Kellerman stood in the doorway of her office, arms crossed over her designer blazer. She was looking at me, not through me, but at me. Her eyes narrowed slightly, scanning my face, my hair, and my clothes. She walked toward me, the click of her heels sounding like gunshots. "I'm Amelia, the director," she said, stopping 3 feet away. "Ray tells me you're in a crisis." "Yes, ma'am," I whispered, keeping my gaze on her chin, avoiding direct eye contact. Amelia circled me slowly, like a shark inspecting potential prey. "We have very limited space, Linda, and we have strict criteria. Where did you say you came from?" "Watertown," I lied. "We live in Watertown. And you have no family? No children?" "My daughter lives in California," I said. She doesn't speak to me. My husband made sure of that." Amelia stopped in front of me again. She tilted her head, studying my face. For a terrifying second, I thought she knew. I thought she saw the ghost of Margaret Thorne beneath the dye and the fear. Her eyes lingered on my nose and my jawline. "You look familiar." she said slowly. My heart stopped. The room spun. I have a common face, I stammered. People always say that. Amelia didn't smile. Do they? She reached out and touched the sleeve of my coat, feeling the cheap fabric. We are a program for women who are ready to rebuild their lives, Linda. Not a flop house. We require commitment. We require resources to help you get back on your feet. This was it. The shakedown. The test. I knew what I had to do. I have money, I whispered, reaching into my bra. I pulled out a thick envelope, $800 in cash. Money I had withdrawn from 3 different ATMs to avoid a paper trail. Money I couldn't afford to lose. I have this, I said, holding it out with a trembling hand. It's my secret savings, coffee money, grocery change. I saved it for years. It's all I have. Please, I can pay. Amelia's eyes dropped to the cash. The suspicion in her face evaporated instantly, replaced by a flicker of greed so naked it was almost obscene. She didn't see a potential threat anymore. She saw revenue. She saw a program fee. She took the envelope. She didn't count it, but she weighed it in her hand. This shows commitment, she said, her voice warming into that fake professional empathy I loathed. It shows you're serious about your recovery. We can work with this. She turned to Ray. Process her. Put her in dorm 3, the open bed. She looked back at me one last time. Welcome to Grace Haven, Linda. I think you'll do well here. She turned and walked back to her office, the envelope of cash disappearing into her pocket. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for a week. I had done it. I was in. But the victory was short-lived. Ray led me down the hallway, past the kitchen, past the laundry room where I had first heard the truth. We entered dorm 3, the room that had been empty on my first tour. Now, 3 of the beds were occupied. That's your bed, Ray said, pointing to a cot in the corner with a thin gray blanket. Settling in period is 24 hours. No visitors. Curfew is 9 p.m. She left, closing the door behind her. I walked to the bed and set my small bag down. My legs were shaking so badly I had to sit. New meat? The voice came from the bed across the room. I looked up. Carmen was sitting there, a book in her lap. She was looking at me with those same ancient, tired eyes I had seen in the parking lot weeks ago, but now they were narrowed and sharp. She studied me, my hair, my face, and the way I sat. I froze. Amelia hadn't recognized me because Amelia only saw what she wanted to see, victims and money. But Carmen saw people. She saw survival. I'm Linda, I said, my voice tight. Carmen didn't answer immediately. She stood up slowly and walked toward me. She stopped 2 feet away, invading my space, her gaze boring into me. You look like shit, Linda, she said quietly. Rough week, I managed. Carmen tilted her head. Her eyes dropped to my hands. My hands, which I realized with horror were clutching the bed frame the exact same way I had clutched the laundry basket that day in the dining hall. Yeah, Carmen said, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. I bet. You know, you remind me of someone. My blood ran cold. Who? I whispered. Carmen stared at me for 5 endless seconds. Then she shrugged. Just a volunteer we had a while back. Old lady, nosy, got herself fired. She leaned in closer. She had the same eyes. She turned and walked back to her bed, picking up her book. Keep your head down, Linda, and hide your wallet. The director isn't the only thief in here. I sat on the thin mattress, my heart pounding against my ribs. Carmen suspected. Maybe she didn't know for sure, but she suspected. And in a place like this, suspicion was dangerous. But I was in. I was inside the fortress. I lay back on the pillow that smelled of industrial detergent and stared at the ceiling. I was surrounded by enemies. I was a criminal living under a fake name. I was 66 years old and I was sleeping on a cot in a room full of strangers. I reached into my bag and touched the hidden pocket where I had stashed the tiny, motion-activated camera I had bought online. Amelia had taken my money. She had taken my name. She had taken my reputation. But she had let the fox into the henhouse. And tonight, the fox was going to start hunting. The first night in Dorm 3 was an education in a specific kind of silence. The silence of women who are afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid to take up space, afraid that even in sleep, they might break a rule that could get them evicted. I lay on the thin mattress, my hip throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache that was no longer an act, staring at the ceiling where a water stain bloomed like a dark bruise. I listened to the sounds of the shelter settling, the hum of the industrial refrigerator down the hall, the distant wail of a siren passing on Washington Street, and the soft, stifled weeping of the woman in the bunk above me. I was 66 years old, a homeowner, a taxpayer, a woman who had spent 40 years filling out forms and following rules, and now I was Linda Wright, a number on a clipboard, and a revenue stream in a winter coat. I clutched my purse to my chest beneath the scratchy gray blanket, my fingers brushing the hard plastic lump of the hidden camera I hadn't yet dared to plant. I was inside, yes, but I was also trapped. If Amelia walked in right now and demanded to search my bag, as she had the right to do under the intake agreement I just signed, it would be over. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like footsteps, and every shadow looked like Amelia standing in the doorway. I spent the night rehearsing my lies, refining the edges of Linda Wright's tragedy, until the gray light of dawn finally bled through the thin blinds. Morning brought the routine, and with it, the reality of the extortion I had only glimpsed from the outside. At 7 a.m., a buzzer sounded, harsh, jarring, and institutional. We lined up for the single shower, heads down, avoiding eye contact. Then we moved to the kitchen for breakfast, lukewarm oatmeal and watery coffee served in styrofoam cups. This was where Amelia did her work. She arrived at 8:30, sweeping into the dining area in a cashmere coat that looked soft enough to melt, bringing with her the scent of expensive vanilla and fresh air. She moved from table to table, touching shoulders, offering smiles, and playing the benevolent matriarch. But I watched her eyes. They didn't see people. They saw accounts receivable. I sat at the end of a long table, hunching over my oatmeal and making myself small. I watched as she stopped at Nina's chair. Nina was a thin, nervous woman I remembered from my volunteer days, though she didn't recognize me in my new guise. She looked terrifyingly frail, with her hands trembling as she held her coffee cup. "Good morning, Nina," Amelia said, her voice dropping to that intimate, concerned register she mastered so well. "How are we feeling today?" "Better, Miss Kellerman," Nina whispered. "Thank you." "That's wonderful," Amelia beamed. She rested a hand on Nina's shoulder, a gesture that looked comforting but was actually a restraint. "I wanted to check in about your weekly contribution. We missed you at the office yesterday." Nina shrank in her seat. I'm waiting on my sister to send a money order. It should be here tomorrow." Amelia's smile didn't waver, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Tomorrow is Friday, Nina. You know the policy. We have a long wait list of women who are ready to commit to their recovery. If you're having trouble prioritizing your stay here, we might need to discuss whether Grace Haven is still the right fit for you." "I am committed," Nina stammered, tears welling in her eyes. "Please, I'll call her again right now. I'll get the money." "See that you do," Amelia said, giving her shoulder a squeeze that was just a little too hard. "We're a family here, Nina, but families contribute." She moved on, leaving Nina weeping silently into her oatmeal. I felt a surge of rage so hot it nearly burned through my disguise. This wasn't charity. It was a shakedown. Amelia was terrorizing these women, dangling their safety over a precipice and demanding they pay for the privilege of not falling. I needed to plant the camera. I needed to capture this, not just the hearsay, but the actual interactions, the threats and the transactions. But the hallway was too exposed. Ray was always at the intake desk, and the new security cameras, the ones I had missed during my initial approach, covered the main corridor. I needed a blind spot, I spent the morning resting in the common room, pleading exhaustion from my injuries. I watched the staff. I watched the cameras, and I found it. There was a decorative ficus tree in the corner of the hallway, just outside Amelia's office door. It was dusty, neglected, and sitting in a heavy ceramic pot. Crucially, it was positioned just beneath the angle of the ceiling camera. If I stood in front of it, my body would block the lens for a few seconds. It was a risk, a massive one, but I had to take it. At 10 a.m., during the mid-morning lull when most residents were in counseling, or rather, waiting for counselors who never showed up, I made my move. I walked down the hallway, exaggerating my limp and clutching a tissue to my face as if I were stifling a coughing fit. I reached the ficus tree. I stopped, leaning against the wall, hacking loudly into the tissue, my body shuddering. "Linda, are you okay?" Ray's voice, coming from the intake desk. I froze, adrenaline spiking. Just needing to catch my breath, I wheezed, waving a hand weakly. "Dust allergy." "Do you need water?" She started to stand up. "No," I said too quickly. I forced another cough. "No, I'm fine. Just give me a second." Ray hesitated, then sat back down, returning to her typing. I had 5 seconds. I turned my back to the camera, shielding the plant with my coat. With a trembling hand, I reached into my pocket, pulled out the tiny black cube, and shoved it deep into the soil at the base of the ficus, angling the lens upward toward the office door. I swept a handful of decorative moss over it, leaving just the pinhole lens exposed. It was done. I pushed myself off the wall, wiped my face, and limped back to the dorm, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had planted the bug. Now, I just had to hope the battery lasted long enough to catch a crime. That afternoon, I sat in the dorm, trying to stop my hands from shaking. Carmen was there, lying on her bunk, reading a paperback with the cover torn off. She hadn't spoken to me since her cryptic warning the day before, but I could feel her eyes on me, heavy and knowing. "You're twitchy, Linda," she said suddenly, not looking up from her book. I jumped. "I'm just cold." Carmen turned a page. "You're not cold. You're nervous. You walk around like you're waiting for the floor to drop out." She closed the book and sat up, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. She stared at me, her expression unreadable. "I figured out who you remind me of." My breath caught. "Who?" "That volunteer," she said. "Margaret, the one who asked too many questions." She stood up and walked over to my bed. She loomed over me, and for a second, I thought she was going to shout, to call for Ray, to expose me right there. "She was a nice lady," Carmen said softly. "But she was stupid. She thought she could fight Amelia with rules. She didn't understand that Amelia owns the rules." She leaned down, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If you were her, or if you knew her, I'd tell her to be careful. Amelia has eyes everywhere. And she doesn't just fire people who cross her. She destroys them." I looked into Carmen's eyes, ancient, tired, but fiercely intelligent. She knew. She absolutely knew. But she wasn't exposing me. She was warning me. "I'll keep that in mind," I whispered. Carmen nodded slowly. "You do that." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. "And if that nice lady was still around, I'd give her this." She dropped the paper on my lap and walked out of the room. I unfolded it with shaking fingers. It was a receipt, a handwritten receipt on a scrap of notebook paper. Received from Carmen Vive, $400 cash. Program fees. Balance remaining, $200. Signed AK. It was proof. Amelia Kellerman taking cash, signing for it personally. I looked at the door where Carmen had disappeared. She wasn't just warning me, she was arming me. I wasn't alone in the lion's den anymore. I had an ally. For the next 2 days, I lived a double life. By day, I was Linda Wright, the meek, battered wife who shuffled through the halls and paid her fees with a trembling hand. By night, I retrieved the memory card from the plant, huddled under my blanket with my laptop, which I kept hidden deep in my bag, and reviewed the footage. The camera angle was perfect. It captured everyone entering and leaving Amelia's office. I watched a parade of misery. Women going in with envelopes. Women coming out crying. But then on Wednesday afternoon, I caught something else. Amelia stood in the doorway, talking to Richard Voss, the board chairman. He was a tall, silver-haired man who looked like every politician I'd ever voted for and regretted. The audit is scheduled for next month, Amelia was saying, her voice clear on the recording. We need to clean up the resident files, get rid of the ones with incomplete payment histories. And the KC invoices, Richard asked, glancing around the hallway. I keep the hard copies in the bottom drawer, Amelia said, laughing. Locked tight, but we should probably shred the older ones, just to be safe. I'll bring the shredder in on Thursday evening after the staff leaves. We can have a little bonfire. I froze the video, staring at the grainy image of Amelia's smiling face. Thursday evening. Tomorrow. She was going to destroy the evidence. She was going to shred the Kellerman Consulting invoices, the physical proof of the embezzlement. The KC folder she mentioned? Hard copies in the bottom drawer. The camera footage gave me the what, but it wasn't enough. A video of them talking about shredding documents was suspicious, but it wasn't a conviction. I needed the documents themselves. I needed to get my hands on those invoices before they went into the shredder. I needed to break into her office. Panic began to rise in my chest, a cold tide. I was 66 years old. I had fake hips and arthritis. I was not a cat burglar. Breaking into a locked office in a building with security cameras was suicide. But if I didn't do it, the evidence would be gone forever. Amelia would wipe the slate clean, pass her audit, and keep grinding women like Nina and Carmen into dust. I looked at the timestamp on the video. Thursday evening after the staff leaves. That was my window. The staff, Ray and the kitchen crew, usually left 5 p.m. Amelia often stayed late or left and came back. But there was always a gap, a shift change, a moment of vulnerability. I spent Thursday morning in a state of hyper-awareness, watching the clock and watching the door. I feigned a migraine to get out of the job skills workshop, which was just Ray reading old classified ads to us. I sat in the common room, ostensibly resting my eyes, but actually watching the office door. I needed a way in. The door was locked whenever Amelia wasn't there. Then, fate handed me a terrifying gift. At 2 p.m., Amelia came out of her office, looking flustered. She was carrying a stack of files. Ray, she called out, I'm heading to the bank, then a donor meeting. I'll be back around 6 to meet Richard. Okay, Ray said. Do you want me to lock up your office? I've got it, Amelia said. She pulled the door shut, jiggled the handle to check it, and walked away. But as she walked past the intake desk, she dropped her keys. They hit the carpet with a muffled thud, a heavy ring with a Mercedes fob and 3 brass keys. Amelia didn't notice. She kept walking, checking her phone, pushing through the front door and out into the cold. Ray didn't notice. She was on the phone with a vendor. I was the only one who saw them. I stared at the keys lying on the gray industrial carpet. They were 10 feet away. I stood up, my heart hammering so hard I felt dizzy. I limped toward the desk. Ray was distracted, arguing about a food delivery. No, we ordered 3 cases of milk, not 2, she was saying, turning her back to me to check a clipboard. I reached the spot and feigned a spasm in my bad leg, lurching forward with a genuine gasp of pain that sent my purse crashing onto the gray carpet. The contents exploded outward. Lipstick, tissues, loose change skittering across the floor. Oh, God, I wheezed, dropping to my knees in a chaotic scramble. While Ray turned back to her call, annoyed by the noise, my hand swept across the carpet in a wide arc, scooping up my lipstick, my tissues, and the heavy brass keyring, shoving the cold metal deep into my coat pocket before my heart could beat one more time. Be careful, Linda, Ray said, turning back to her call. I walked back to the dorm, the keys burning a hole in my pocket. I had Amelia's keys. I had access. But I also had a ticking clock. Amelia would realize they were missing. Maybe not immediately. She might think she left them in the car or at home, but soon. And she said she'd be back at 6. It was 2:15 p.m. I couldn't do it now. The hallway was too busy. Residents were moving around, and Ray was at the desk. I had to wait for the lull, the shift change. By 5 p.m., Ray would leave. The night monitor, a college student named Jessica who spent her entire shift wearing headphones, would arrive at 5:30. That gave me 30 minutes. 30 minutes where the office was unguarded. 30 minutes before Amelia returned to shred the evidence. I sat on my bed, clutching the keys in my pocket, and realized I was about to commit a burglary. Not a metaphor, a felony. I looked at Carmen across the room. She was napping. I looked at Nina. She was busy writing a letter to her sister, begging for money. I thought about the prosecutor telling me I wouldn't survive prison. I thought about Edward, who always followed the rules. And then I thought about Amelia Kellerman, laughing about burning the invoices. I took a deep breath. Margaret Thorne was dead. Linda Wright was a fiction. The woman sitting on this bed was something else entirely. Something dangerous. I waited for the sun to go down. The winter darkness fell early, turning the windows into black mirrors. At 4:55 p.m., Ray packed up her bag. I watched her from the doorway of the common room. She looked tired and defeated. She locked the front door, set the alarm for evening mode, and walked out to her battered Honda. The building was silent. The residents were in the dining hall for early dinner. The hallway was empty. I checked my watch. 5:05 p.m. Jessica, the night monitor, was notoriously late. She wouldn't be here for at least 20 minutes. This was it. I walked down the hallway. I didn't limp. There was no time for the act. I moved with a speed and purpose I hadn't felt in months. I reached Amelia's office door and pulled out the stolen keys. My hand shook violently as I tried the first one. It didn't fit. Panic flared. What if these are her house keys? What if I tried the second one? It slid in. I turned it. Click. The lock disengaged. I pushed the door open and slipped inside, closing it softly behind me. I was in. The office smelled of Amelia, vanilla, and money. The streetlights outside cast long, skeletal shadows across the room. I didn't turn on the light. I couldn't risk being seen from the parking lot. I pulled out my phone and switched on the flashlight, keeping the beam low. Bottom drawer, Amelia had said. Locked tight. I moved behind the massive mahogany desk. I tried the drawers. The top one was unlocked. There were pens and paper clips. Middle one was unlocked, with personal items. The bottom one was locked. I fumbled with the key ring again. Tried the small brass key. It turned. I pulled the drawer open. It was packed with file folders. I flipped through them, my heart racing. Receipts 2023, vendor contracts, board minutes, and then at the very back, a red folder. Label KC invoices/confidential. I pulled it out and opened it, and there they were, dozens of invoices. Kellerman Consulting, services rendered strategic oversight, amount $45,000. Attached to each invoice was a check stub. Paid to Amelia Kellerman, it was the smoking gun, the holy grail, the proof that would send her to prison for a decade. I started photographing them. Click, flip, click, flip. My hands were shaking so hard the first few were blurry. I forced myself to breathe, to focus, to get the dates and the signatures. I photographed 20 invoices. Then I found a second folder, ledger, actual versus reported. I opened it, 2 columns of numbers, one for the IRS and one for Amelia. Click, flip, click. I was halfway through the ledger when I heard it. The sound of a car door slamming in the parking lot. I froze. I ran to the window and peeked through the blinds. A black Mercedes. Amelia was back, early, and she was walking toward the front door. I checked my watch, 5:20 p.m. She wasn't supposed to be here until 6. I looked at the mess on the desk, the open drawer, the folders scattered. I had maybe 90 seconds before she walked through that office door. There was no way out. The window didn't open, painted shut decades ago. The only exit was the door Amelia was walking toward. I shoved the folders back into the drawer. I tried to lock it, but my sweaty fingers slipped on the key. It clattered to the floor. Oh, God. I dropped to my knees to find it. The flashlight beam swept under the desk. I heard the front door of the shelter beeping open. Hello? Amelia's voice? Ray? Are you still here? There were footsteps in the hallway, clicking heels, coming closer. I grabbed the key. I locked the drawer, but I couldn't get out. She was 10 feet away, 5 feet. I looked around the room. There was nowhere to hide. The closet was shallow. The curtains were sheer. The desk. It was a massive executive desk with a modesty panel in the front and a dark cavern underneath. I scrambled on my hands and knees. I forced my stiff, 66-year-old joints to bend in ways they hadn't moved in decades, suppressing a gasp of agony as I crawled into the cramped crawl space. I curled into a ball, pulling my legs tight against my chest and praying my shoes weren't visible. The office door handle turned. The door opened. The overhead lights flickered on. I stopped breathing. I watched a pair of black designer heels walk into the room and stop directly in front of the desk. That's strange, Amelia muttered to herself. She sniffed the air. She smelled me. My cheap detergent. My fear. She walked around the desk. She was going to sit down. She was going to slide her chair in and her knees were going to hit my spine. I squeezed my eyes shut and waited for the scream. Amelia pulled the high-backed leather chair out, the wheels rolling ominously across the plastic floor mat. I pressed myself back against the wood of the modesty panel, my spine curving into a painful C shape, with my chin tucked to my chest. I stared at the carpet, watching the toes of her black heels. She sat. The seat dipped under her weight. She rolled forward, scooting the chair in. The caster wheel hit the toe of my sneaker. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted copper, strangling the yelp of pain before it could escape my throat. I didn't move my foot. I couldn't. If I moved, the fabric of my coat would rustle. If I stayed, her weight was pinning me. Amelia didn't notice. She spun the chair slightly, reaching for the phone. Richard? She said, her voice echoing in the small enclosed space under the desk. I'm here. Where are you? She paused. Good. I'm just organizing the files before the shredder gets here. Meet me inside. She hung up. I was trapped. Richard Voss was outside. Amelia was sitting on top of me, and I had 20 stolen invoices captured on my phone, which was currently burning a hole in my pocket. Amelia opened the top drawer. I heard the rustle of papers, then the middle drawer. Then she reached for the bottom drawer. I heard her hand rattle the handle. What? She muttered. She tried it again. Jiggle thud. I just unlocked this, she whispered to herself. She rolled the chair back, releasing my crushed toe and bent down. I saw her face appear upside down in the gap between the desk and the floor. Her hair brushed the carpet. She was looking for the key I had dropped. Our eyes met. For a split second, there was no recognition, just the confusion of a woman seeing eyes staring back at her from the darkness under her desk. Then she screamed. It was a primal, terrified sound that shattered the silence of the shelter. She scrambled back, kicking out with her heels, one of them catching me in the shoulder. The chair flew backward and crashed into the wall. Who is there? She shrieked. Get out! Get out! The jig was up. There was no running. There was no hiding. I rolled out from under the desk, my joints popping and screaming in protest, and scrambled to my knees. I looked up to see Amelia Kellerman pressed against the filing cabinet, clutching a letter opener like a dagger, her chest heaving. She looked at me, at the dyed hair, the Goodwill coat, the fake bruises on my arm. Linda? She breathed, her fear morphing into confusion. What the hell are you doing under my desk? I stood up, my bad hip nearly giving out. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to get out of that room before Richard arrived. I dropped my earring, I stammered, backing toward the door. I'm so sorry. I came in to clean and I dropped it. Amelia's eyes narrowed. She looked at the desk. She saw the splintered wood around the lock on the bottom drawer, damage I hadn't noticed I'd caused in my haste. She saw the folders sitting on top of the desk, clearly disturbed. She looked back at me, and the confusion vanished. In its place was a cold, razor-sharp realization. "You didn't drop an earring," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You broke into my desk." "I have to go," I said, reaching for the doorknob. "Stop." The door swung open before I could touch it. Richard Voss stood there filling the frame. He was a large man, broad-shouldered in a wool coat, holding a heavy briefcase. He looked from Amelia to me, taking in the scene instantly. "What's happening?" he asked, stepping into the room and blocking my exit. "She broke in," Amelia hissed, pointing at me with the letter opener. "She was under the desk. She went through the KC files." Richard's face went pale. He locked the door behind him and turned the deadbolt. I was sealed in. "Who are you?" Richard asked, stepping closer to me. "You're a resident?" "I'm leaving," I said, trying to summon the voice of Margaret Thorne, the authority I used to wield. "Let me out or I will scream." Amelia moved away from the wall. She walked toward me, slowly, studying my face. She wasn't looking at Linda anymore. She was peeling back the layers. She looked at my hands, my unmanicured, aging hands that didn't match the dye job. She looked at my eyes. "You're not Linda," she whispered. She reached out and grabbed my chin, forcing my face up to the light. I tried to pull away, but Richard grabbed my arm, holding me fast. Amelia stared into my eyes. "I know you." She searched her memory, scrolling through the faces of the hundreds of women she had exploited, until she landed on the one person who had dared to challenge her. "Margaret," she said, the name sounding like a curse. "Margaret Thorne." She stepped back, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred contorting her features. "You crazy old witch, you actually came back." "I came back for the truth," I said, my voice shaking but loud. "I have the photos, Amelia. I have the invoices. I have the ledger. It's over." Amelia looked at Richard. Richard looked at the phone in my hand. "Get the phone," Amelia ordered. Richard twisted my arm behind my back. I cried out as pain shot through my shoulder, my real shoulder, not the fake injury. I dropped the phone. Amelia snatched it up. She didn't unlock it. She couldn't, but she held it like a trophy. "You have nothing," she sneered. "You are trespassing. You are violating a restraining order, and you broke into a private office." She walked to the shredder in the corner and turned it on. "We're going to call the police," Amelia said calmly. "We're going to tell them we found a deranged stalker hiding in my office, and we're going to say you attacked me. Look at this." She ripped the sleeve of her own blouse and knocked a vase off the shelf, shattering it on the floor. "Self-defense," Richard muttered, tightening his grip on my arm until I thought the bone would snap. "And while the police are on their way," Amelia said, picking up the stack of invoices from the desk, "we're going to do a little cleaning." She fed the first invoice into the machine. The motor whined to life, a high-pitched grinding screech, followed by the sickening crunch of paper being chewed into confetti. It was the sound of justice dying. "No," I screamed, struggling against Richard. "You can't. You're destroying the truth." "Watch me," she smiled. She fed the second one, then the third. I watched my evidence, the only proof I had, turn into confetti. "You're going to jail, Margaret," Amelia said over the noise of the machine. "And you're going to die there, an old, crazy woman who didn't know when to quit." She was right. I was watching my life end. But then the doorknob rattled. "Amelia?" A voice from the hallway. It wasn't Ray, and it wasn't Jessica. It was Carmen. "Amelia, open the door." Carmen shouted. "Go away," Amelia yelled back. "We're in a meeting." We heard screaming. Another voice. "Nina, open the door or we're calling 911. Amelia froze. She looked at the shredder. Then she looked at Richard. "Ignore them," Richard hissed. "Finish it." But the pounding got louder. It wasn't just two women. It sounded like an army. "Open the door," Tasha's voice. "We know she's in there. We know it's Linda." And then the sound of a key in the lock. Amelia's eyes went wide. "How?" I remembered the keys I had stolen. I remembered dropping my purse in the hallway earlier to create a distraction. Had I dropped something else? Or had Carmen? The door swung open. Carmen stood there holding the master key, stolen from Jessica the night monitor, I realized later. Behind her stood Nina, Tasha, and 5 other residents, and every single one of them was holding up a phone. Recording. What do you think you're doing? Amelia shrieked, trying to block the view of the shredder. Get out! This is a private office. We're live, Carmen said, her voice steady as a rock. Facebook Live. 200 people watching right now. Say hi, Amelia. She panned the phone to Richard, who immediately let go of my arm and covered his face, backing into the corner. And look, Carmen said, panning down to me, slumped on the floor, clutching my shoulder. There's Linda, or Margaret. Whatever her name is, she looks hurt. She broke in. Amelia yelled, but her voice cracked. She knew. She knew the narrative had just shifted. She wasn't controlling the room anymore. The world was watching. She has the proof, I shouted, pointing at the shredder. She's shredding the invoices. Kellerman Consulting. Carmen moved the phone toward the shredder. Is that right, Amelia? What are you shredding at 6 p.m. on a Thursday evening? Sirens wailed in the distance. Amelia had called the police to arrest me, but now those sirens sounded like Judgment Day. The next hour was a blur of chaos. The Newton police arrived. They found me on the floor, found Amelia standing over a pile of shredded paper, and found 8 residents refusing to stop recording. But the law is a blunt instrument. It doesn't understand nuance. It understands facts. Fact, I was inside a locked office without permission. Fact, I had a fake ID in my pocket. Fact, I had a restraining order against me, prohibiting me from being within 500 feet of Amelia Kellerman. The officer, a young man who looked overwhelmed by the screaming women, read me my rights. Margaret Thorne, you are under arrest for criminal trespass, burglary, and violation of a protection order. He cuffed my hands behind my back. The metal bit into my wrists, cold and final. She was shredding evidence. Carmen screamed at the officer. Look at the machine. That's a matter for investigators, ma'am, the officer said tiredly. Right now, I have a suspect who is legally barred from this premises. They led me out. I walked past Amelia, who was leaning against her desk, pale and shaking but still free. She met my eyes as I passed. She didn't smile this time. She looked terrified. But I was the one in handcuffs. I was the one they put in the back of the cruiser, and I was the one they drove to the station while the neighbors watched from their porches. The processing was a nightmare I had never imagined in my middle-class life. They took my fingerprints, pressing my ink-stained thumbs onto the card. They took my mugshot, the flash blinding me, capturing my haggard face and dyed hair for eternity. They took my clothes, my Goodwill disguise, and gave me an orange jumpsuit that smelled of bleach and other people's sweat. They put me in a holding cell with a woman who was coming down off heroin. She vomited in the corner while I sat on the metal bench, shivering and staring at the concrete floor. I was 66 years old. I was a felon, and I had lost. I spent 3 days in that cell, 3 days of bright lights that never turned off, 3 days of sandwiches that tasted like cardboard, and 3 days of wondering if I would die there. I thought about Edward. I thought about how disappointed he would be, and I thought about Kara, my daughter, finding out her mother was in jail. But mostly, I thought about the shredder. Screech, crunch. I had been so close, I had held the proof in my hands, and now it was confetti. On the 4th morning, the guard unlocked the door. Thorne, you made bail. I blinked in the harsh light. Who? Does it matter? Get your stuff. I walked out into the lobby, blinking against the sun. Kara was there. She looked 10 years older than the last time I saw her. Her eyes were red from crying. She didn't say a word. She just hugged me hard like she was trying to hold my pieces together. Let's go home, Mom, she whispered. We drove in silence. But as we turned onto my street, I saw it. A black car parked 3 houses down, tinted windows, engine running. I grabbed Kara's arm. Don't stop. What? That car. It's them. It's Richard Voss. Kara looked. Mom, you're paranoid. It's just a car. They aren't just watching, Kara. They were waiting, I whispered, sliding down in the seat. Amelia registered as a victim when she filed the restraining order. That means the Vine system sent her an automated text the second my bail was posted. She knew I was coming home before you did. I was out of jail, but I wasn't free. I was a witness to a crime I couldn't prove, and I had just declared war on people who had millions of dollars and everything to lose. The shredder had destroyed the paper, but it hadn't destroyed my memory, and it hadn't destroyed the one thing Amelia Kellerman forgot about, the cloud, Carmen's Facebook Live video. It was still out there, and people were watching. The weeks following my release on bail were a blur of legal terror. My lawyer, Linda Vasquez, sat me down in her office and laid out the reality of my situation with brutal clarity. The prosecutor wasn't interested in my vigilantism. He was interested in the fact that I had broken into a private business, falsified identification, and violated a restraining order. The plea deal on the table was grim. Plead guilty to felony burglary and serve 18 months in state prison, or go to trial and risk 7 years. I spent my days sitting in my living room with the blinds drawn, watching the street for the black minivan that sometimes idled 3 houses down. I felt small. I felt foolish. I felt like the cautionary tale everyone warned me I would become. Amelia Kellerman was still running Grace Haven, still driving her Mercedes, and still shredding documents while I was preparing to spend my remaining years in a cage. But I had underestimated the power of the signal we had sent out. Carmen's Facebook Live video hadn't just been seen by 200 people. It had been shared, then shared again, then picked up by a local blogger in Newton, then a subreddit dedicated to local crime. People saw the shredder, heard the desperation in my voice, saw the luxury car in the parking lot and the peeling paint in the dormitories, and they started asking questions. 3 weeks before my scheduled plea hearing, my phone rang. It wasn't Linda, and it wasn't Kara. Miss Thorne, this is Special Agent Miller with the FBI's White Collar Crimes Division. I nearly dropped the phone. The FBI? We've been monitoring the chatter regarding Grace Haven, he said, his voice calm and precise, and we received a very interesting package yesterday from an anonymous source. It contained a thumb drive with video footage from inside the shelter, footage of cash transactions, and footage of board members discussing kickbacks. My heart stopped. The camera, I whispered. The ficus tree. We believe so, Miller said. We executed a search warrant on Miss Kellerman's home this morning. We found the hard drive she thought she had wiped. The forensic team is recovering the deleted files now, including the invoices for a Kellerman Consulting. I started to cry, silent, shaking sobs that racked my entire body. We need you to come in, Miss Thorne, Miller said gently. Not as a suspect, as a witness. The charges against me were dropped. In the interest of justice, 48 hours later, the district attorney, realizing he was about to prosecute the whistleblower in a massive federal fraud case, quietly folded his tent. Amelia Kellerman was arrested on a Tuesday. I watched it on the news from my living room. They led her out of her beautiful Newton home in handcuffs, her hair disheveled, and her face pale and devoid of makeup. She didn't look like a queen anymore. She looked like a common thief. But the war wasn't over. It was just moving to a courtroom. The trial took place 6 months later at the Moakley Federal Courthouse in Boston. I attended every single day. I sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing my best suit, my gray hair grown back out, staring at the back of Amelia's head. I needed her to see me. I needed her to know I was still standing. The prosecution paraded a chorus of damnation to the stand. Carmen, Nina, Tasha, and a dozen others, who wove a tapestry of identical heartbreak. Carmen testified about the program fees that drained her savings, leaving her unable to afford an apartment deposit when she finally left. She spoke about the cold food, the lack of heat in the winter, and the way Amelia looked at them like livestock. Nina cried on the stand as she described being threatened with eviction if she didn't ask her family for more money. "I thought she was trying to help me," Nina sobbed. "I thought I was the problem." Then it was my turn. I walked to the witness box, my bad hip aching. A permanent souvenir of my time as Linda Wright. I swore to tell the truth. The defense attorney tried to paint me as unhinged. He brought up the break-in. He brought up the fake ID. He asked if I considered myself a vigilante. "I consider myself a citizen," I said, my voice steady, looking directly at the jury. "I saw a crime being committed against vulnerable women, and when the state refused to investigate, I investigated it myself." "You broke the law, Miss Thorne," the attorney snapped. "Yes," I said. "I did, and I would do it again. Because while I was breaking a lock, your client was breaking lives." The jury deliberated for 4 days. Those were the longest 96 hours of my life. I sat in the hallway with Carmen and Tasha, drinking bad coffee and waiting for the other shoe to drop. We didn't talk much. We just sat together, a silent sisterhood of survivors. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was packed. We, the jury, find the defendant, Amelia Marie Kellerman, guilty on count 1, wire fraud. Amelia didn't flinch. Guilty on count 2, mail fraud. Her lawyer put a hand on her arm. Guilty on count 3, money laundering. Guilty on count 4, conspiracy. 23 counts, guilty on all charges. When the final guilty rang out, Amelia finally broke. Her shoulders slumped and her head bowed. The mask of the imperious director shattered, leaving behind a terrified middle-aged woman facing decades in a cage. She turned around. She looked at the gallery, looked at Carmen, looked at Nina, and then she looked at me. There was no hatred in her eyes anymore, no arrogance, just a hollow, haunting emptiness. She looked at me like she was drowning, and I was the only one on the shore. I didn't smile. I didn't look away. I just watched her until the marshals let her out. The judge sentenced her to 14 years in federal prison. He ordered full restitution, the seizure of the beach house, the Mercedes, the investment accounts, and the jewelry. Everything she had stolen, everything she had built her life on, was gone. Grace Haven was closed. The assets were liquidated to pay back the victims. It wasn't enough. It never is. But checks started going out. Carmen got $3,000 back. Nina got $1,200. It wasn't a fortune, but it was validation. It was the system finally saying, "We see you. You matter." 6 months later, we reopened the facility under a new name, Guardian House. This time, there was no Mercedes in the parking lot. There were no program fees. Carmen was the new director of operations. She didn't have a degree, but she had something better. She knew the game. She knew how to spot a predator. She knew how to protect the flock. I sat on the advisory board. I came in on Tuesdays to help with intake. One afternoon, I was in the office, the same office where I had hidden under the desk filing paperwork. The phone rang. It was Linda Vasquez, my lawyer. "Margaret," she said, her voice grim, "I have some news. You're not going to like it." "What is it? Did she appeal?" "No, the appeal was denied. But Amelia has been busy in Danbury." My stomach tightened. "Busy how?" "She's writing a book," Linda said. "She secured a deal with a publisher in New York, a memoir." Linda paused, and I could hear the disgust in her voice. She's calling it The Glass Shelter. The subtitle is How One Woman's Mission of Mercy Was Destroyed by a Vigilante's Vendetta. The publisher is pitching it as a redemption story. A misunderstood visionary taken down by a grief-stricken, mentally unstable widow. They're already talking about a movie option. I felt the bile rise in my throat. "She's in prison, Linda. How can she do this?" "She has rights, and she has a story. The book is set to release next spring, just in time for her first parole hearing." I hung up the phone. I looked out the window at the parking lot where a young mother was walking her toddler toward the entrance. Safe. For now. Amelia wasn't done. She was rewriting history. She was planning her comeback. She was going to use my name, my grief, and my actions to paint herself as the victim and me as the monster. I looked at the shredder in the corner of the office, a new one, heavy duty. I walked over to the filing cabinet. I unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside was a new folder, red, labeled AK Watch List. It contained every news article, every court transcript, and every lie Amelia had ever told. It contained the names of the publisher, the editor, and the publicist. I wasn't a social worker anymore. I wasn't just a volunteer. I picked up my pen. I started making a list. Amelia Kellerman made one fatal mistake. She thought that putting bars between us meant the war was over. She thought that writing a book would rewrite the truth. She forgot that I wasn't Margaret Thorne anymore. Margaret Thorne was a nice lady who followed the rules. The woman sitting in this office? The woman who had broken into a desk, lied to the police, and brought down an empire? She was something else entirely. I picked up the phone and dialed Carmen. "She's writing a book," I said when she answered. Carmen didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She just let out a low, dangerous hum. "Okay," Carmen said. "Then we write the sequel." "Are you ready?" I asked. "I was born ready," she said. "Let's burn it down again." I hung up. I looked at the camera lens hidden in the new ficus plant. We kept it there just in case. Mercy has limits, and I had reached mine a long time ago. You don't just get better at fighting evil. You just get deadlier. You've made it to the end. You walked through the fire with Margaret. But I have to be honest, it breaks my heart when I see people listen to these stories, feel these heavy emotions, and then just walk away. No subscription, no support, just silence. It feels like I'm pouring my soul into a void, working days and nights to bring these voices to life, only to be met with ghost viewers. Please, don't be another ghost. If this story kept you company, don't just take it and leave. You owe it to the story to leave a mark. A subscribe, a super thanks, or even just commenting your city. Tell me where in the world you are listening from. Let me know exactly where my voice is traveling so I know I'm not alone in this. And if you aren't ready to leave yet, don't. There are 2 more real-life journeys right here on your screen. Pick one. Stay with me a little longer. Don't let the silence win. Until next time.